Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today a look at the Meze Elite headphones. If you're at all a regular follower of my channel, you'll know that I have loved the Meze Empyreans for quite some time. I've recommended them to anybody who's in that rough ballpark price range and looking for a fun, engaging, and also technically solid headphone. Admittedly, they're not necessarily on the level of something like the Susvara in terms of pure technicalities and accuracy and transparency, but they are just so fun. And so I kind of had mixed feelings when I heard about the release of the Meze Elites, because on one hand the idea of an even better Empyrean was very exciting, but I was also nervous that they might lose the magic that makes the Empyrean so much fun. The Elites retail for about $4,000 US, which is a full $1,000 US more than the original Empyreans. So for this review, there's quite a lot to cover. I'm obviously going to talk to you about the design, the features, accessories, comfort, all that sort of stuff with the Elites. I'm going to talk about their sound quality, of course. And then I want to compare them to the Empyreans as sort of my benchmark of what I was expecting from these, but also against the Focal Utopia and also the Hi-Fiman Susvara. But before we get into any details, let's start with a look at the absolutely gorgeous Meze Elite. You may sometimes see these referred to as the Empyrean Elite. There has been, I think, a bit of a branding mix-up. Some of the packaging says Empyrean Elite, but in chatting to Meze Audio directly, they said that this is a completely different headphone and it is called the Elite and not the Empyrean Elite, so it is just the Elite. Now obviously no one's pretending that this is a ground-up brand new design. They've absolutely taken all of the design cues from the original Empyrean. But in producing the Elite, they've changed the driver and they've changed the pads to make a totally different headphone. At the same time though, they've kept all of the things that made the Empyrean so wonderful. So looking at the Elites here, we've got essentially what looks on the surface like a silver and black Empyrean. You've still got the same sprung tilting mechanism, the same spline with this really smooth, easy to move slider. Everything about it's pretty much the same. It's got the same wing style leather headband, which is incredibly comfortable, and that's housed within a carbon fiber headband. So all of this is completely unchanged. Twin 3-pin mini XLR connectors on the bottom receive the cable inputs. So really everything is looking identical until you get to the pads. And of course the colour scheme, that goes without saying. When we get to the pads here, this is where things start to get different. So here we've got the hybrid pad from Meze. This is a brand new pad that is a combination of leather on the outer sections, so both the outer edge and the section that touches the skin. And then on the inside, you've got a fenestrated Alcantara. Fenestrated meaning it's got the holes in it. And so this is a completely different pad. It's much shallower than the old leather pads on the Empyrean. If I pick that up now, hopefully you can see here, it's a very deep, deep pad. Whereas on the hybrids, it is much shallower. Now that's good and bad. It means that with these on, you don't feel quite as closed in by the headphone. It's a bit of a lighter touch. It means the clamping force is maybe not quite as strong, but it's still just fine. But the drawback for me was that I now find every now and again, just the tiniest little bit of my ear is able to touch the grill on the inside. And it can be quite disconcerting because it's just enough to just really finely tickle. It doesn't get uncomfortable or anything like that, but it feels like there's a hair stuck in one of the grills and it's just kind of tickling the top of my ear. I found as I used these for longer, the sensation went away, so I don't know if I got used to it or if something changed, the pads maybe settled in differently. I don't know what's going on. But certainly when I first got these, every couple of moments I would feel like I needed to take the headphone off and clear a bit of hair away from my ears. So I don't know what was going on there, but that's how it felt. In addition to the hybrid pads, you also get these Alcantara pads, which are exactly the same as what came with the Empyrean. So you've got one pair of pads the same and one pair of pads that are different. I'm not going to go into huge detail about the various pad rolling on these. They make a difference. I'll talk about the Alcantara and the hybrid pad in the sound quality section, but just briefly I want to cover off that I did try the leather pads from the Empyreans on the Elites, and to me, there's no reason at all to use them. They don't do good things with the tuning of the Elite. They make it a bit too uneven and bumpy sounding, and I just wouldn't bother with it. So definitely for me, it's the hybrids and the Alcantaras. Don't worry about the leathers from the original Empyreans. While we're talking accessories, you've no doubt seen, and I probably should have mentioned this at the beginning, the great big briefcase on my desk here. That's what the Elites come in, exactly the same as the Empyrean. You open the briefcase up and the headphones are nestled beautifully inside, really well protected with the cable that you've chosen and also a bit of warranty information on a card. So it's a lovely unboxing experience with these. I'm not a huge one for packaging, but these definitely impress. And so while we're talking accessories, the other thing to mention is that the Elites come with the same cables as the Empyrean. So that's this guy here. I haven't even unwrapped it, as I'll explain in a moment. It's a sort of fabricy, nylon-y wrapped cable. It's a nice enough cable. The finishing terminations are all beautiful, high quality terminations, all metal, the splitter's metal, everything about it feels great. But at the same time, it's not as premium as I'd like to see with a headphone of this level. And the reason I say that is because the sound quality from this cable is not on the level that it could be and probably should be for a headphone of $4,000 price tag. You may have seen my separate review of the upgrade cable from Meze Audio for the Empyreans, which is sitting here. And that cable is a significant upgrade, both in terms of the sonics of the cable, so it does improve the sound of both the Empyrean and of the Elite, but also ergonomically. This cable is just spectacular. It drapes beautifully, it doesn't hold any shape or coil, it's got the same super high quality connectors that you do find on the stock cable, but it's just a better experience overall. There's no fabric to catch on anything, and as I said before, the sound quality is superb. So do check out my separate review of this cable if you're interested in that. But what I'm going to say here in relation to the Elites is that I think it would have been really nice if they'd actually come with one of these upgrade cables. So Meze Audio have two cables. They've got the copper and the silver-plated copper. Both of them are made by Furukawa. It's very high-quality metal, and it does show through in the sound you get from it. So in my mind, it would have been lovely to see the Elites come with that grade of cable. But let's also put things in perspective. If you buy the $6,000 Susvara, you get one of the worst headphone cables on the planet. Likewise, if you buy the $4,000 Utopia, you get a decent cable, but nothing special. So whilst I'm sitting here saying that I do think the Elites should come with a better cable, they're actually doing as well, if not better, than any other company. I think this stock cable is better than the Utopia cable and better than the Susvara cable, and so I don't think we should be complaining too much about this. But overall, as an industry, it would be nice to see high-end headphone manufacturers that are asking for $4,000, $6,000 headphone price tags. I think they should start to up their game on cables. So that's just a side note. I think the Meze cable is one of the best I've seen, but it could still be better. So having covered off all of the bits and pieces about the external physical design, accessories, all that sort of stuff, let's talk about what's going on inside the Meze Elites. Now these pads, just like the Empyreans, have this wonderful magnetic release. There's no clicking, there's no rotation. You just pull them off and push them back on again. It's a wonderful design. There's a few brands doing it, but not very many. So on the inside here, we've got a very similar looking driver to what's in the Empyreans, but in reality, it's been redesigned. It's highly efficient. It uses the same switchback and spiral style trace on the diaphragm. So what that means is that the top section of the diaphragm has sort of this zigzaggy line, and then the bottom section of the diaphragm has a spiral type trace. And so what that means is that it's giving you, and this is the same as the Empyrean, it's giving you different ways of driving the signal depending on which part of the trace you look at. And the idea behind this is that bass frequencies are very non-directional, so they tend to spread out really easily. whereas treble frequencies are much more directional. On top of that, I believe the shape of the trace has something to do with the way the driver moves and produces high frequency and low frequency. And so when you bring that all together, what that means is they've placed the switchback trace, which is the zigzaggy one, at the top of the diaphragm, so it actually sits up above the entry of the ear canal. That's producing the bass notes, the lower frequencies, and therefore it doesn't matter that it's not firing directly into the ear. Where it does matter what's firing into the ear is the treble frequencies, and they're handled by that spiral pattern. According to Meze and their partner Renaro, who produced the driver, that makes for a better sonic experience by separating out the types of traces that are producing the sound and then placing them according to what matters most, going straight into the ear versus the non-directional section for the bass. Whether it really makes a difference or not, I'm not able to say. What I can tell you is that there are other headphones that are amazing that don't use this technology, but certainly there is a degree of proof in the pudding when it comes to the Elite and the Empyrean. They're doing something right because both sound fantastic, as I'll get to soon. Ultimately, in looking at all of the details on the website, the drivers are very, very slightly different, but from what I can tell, it's going to come down to things like the thickness and weight of the diaphragm material, and maybe the tensioning of that material into the actual frame of the driver. And I say that because the design of the traces is the same, the general shape of the diaphragms is the same. There's a lot of stuff which seems to be identical. So there are going to be very subtle tweaks they've made to get the performance increase they have out of the Elites. The other thing it's done is actually make them even more sensitive. Both the Empyrean and the Elite can be driven by pretty much any source. Of course, you're going to want a good quality source to hear them at their best, but to get to 110 decibels, which is starting to borderline into pain or discomfort, at least for most people, you only need 8 milliwatts to get the Elites there. The Empyrean needed 10 milliwatts. So you can see neither of these are power-hungry headphones. They're very easy to get plenty of volume from. Performance is different, and that's going to come down to the quality of the amp, but in terms of volume, you can absolutely get it from anything. And so let's move on now and talk about sound quality. I came into my time with the Elites with high expectations. As I said before, I've loved the Empyreans for ages. They've been my favourite headphone, even after I got the Susvaras. And so I expected great things, but I also had some trepidations too. And when I took these out of the box, plugged them in and started listening, I was very, very underwhelmed. I heard a tonality that was off. It had an overly forward mid-range that I found very unnatural and displeasing. And so I reached out to one of my channel patrons who I knew already had the Elites and had a chat to him. After some further discussion and some cable swapping, the Elites started to sound more like what I expected. And as it turns out, it had nothing to do with the cables. These are a headphone that actually does need burn-in. Now, I'm not always a huge proponent of burn-in. Most headphones I ever get, I get them out of the box, I plug them in, and I start listening to them. No doubt there might be subtle shifts in the way the driver performs as it loosens up a little bit. It is a physically moving part, so it makes sense. But in all of my time listening to all the different headphones I have, I've very rarely come across headphones that I don't like out of the box, but which transform over the first, we're not talking huge amounts of time here, maybe 10 hours of listening, transform into something fantastic. For now though, I just wanted to say that the Elites should not be judged when you first open the box. Make sure you give them a few days of listening, plug them in, leave them playing overnight if you want to, or just keep listening and let them evolve. Once they're settled down, I started to thoroughly enjoy what I was hearing. As I'll talk about soon, there are things I still miss from the Empyreans. There are still things that I don't think the Elites do as well as other headphones, but all in all, they are very enjoyable. To be clear, almost all of what I'm going to tell you now is using the hybrid pads because I do believe they're the best choice. The Alcantara pads are nicer on the Elites than I found them to be on the Empyreans, but at the same time, I think the hybrid strikes the perfect balance. And so what I'm about to describe is the Elites running the hybrid pads. I did try the Alcantara pads on a few different occasions, and what I'd say about the Alcantaras is I think they're probably going to suit people who are looking for a slightly lighter touch at times, or maybe to suit your overall music tastes. They're a pad that can bring a nice, different flavour to the Elites. I can see them being great for acoustic music, small ensemble type of stuff, and even orchestral music where you want a bit more air and a bit more brightness in the sound without obviously going too far. So whilst I almost never use the Alcantaras on the Empyreans, I can definitely see myself reaching for them from time to time with the Elites. And that's really nice. It's not two different tunings that some will like one and some will like the other. I can definitely see people liking both tunings of the Elites, being the hybrid pad tuning and the Alcantara pad tuning. I can see people getting use out of both, and that's fantastic. But for the rest of this review, unless I say otherwise, I'm talking about the hybrids. And so let's get into talking about the Elite sound. The easiest way to sum up the Elites after that burning process is done is to say that they just balance everything perfectly. The tonal balance of these is really, really exceptional, to the point that they're almost too good. And what I mean by that is there are times that I'm listening to them and I kind of wonder if they're actually that special at all. It's like everything is so easy and smooth, but still detailed and resolving, as I'll talk about. But everything's so balanced and easy that you don't kind of notice anything specific. There's nothing overtly special about any individual part of the frequency response. It's just that everything about the frequency response is great. And so they're very special in that regard, but they're also at times a little bit off-putting in that regard. I literally occasionally have to put on other headphones to remind myself that these actually are doing something special, because it sounds too easy, too effortless, and just perfect. I'll put that into more context when I get to the Susvara, Empyrean and Utopia comparisons, but I did want to flag that straight away. These are a headphone I can see people listening to and going, yeah, they're nice, and maybe not thinking they're that special. But they're a headphone that as you listen to more tracks and hear it, kind of not adjust, because clearly it's always the same frequency response, but it's like it takes every genre, every recording, every source in its stride and just shares with you what's coming down the source chain. It's really beautiful like that. The treble is extended and clean, but there's no brightness or peakiness to be found. The mid-range is full and rich, but it's articulate and it's agile, and the bass has presence and speed, but it's not overemphasized in the way that admittedly the Empyrean is. Now, I love the Empyrean for its overemphasis of the bass, but at the same time, the Elites are definitely the better tonally balanced headphone. There is no doubt about that in my mind. The Empyreans are a guilty pleasure, whereas the Elites are your staple. They're the headphone that you can go to for anything and everything, and they're going to sound great. They also shouldn't offend anybody or put anybody off, whereas I can definitely imagine some people hearing the Empyreans and being absolutely, not overwhelmed, that's probably too strong, but put off by the amount of bass they put forwards and the level of emphasis that produces in the lower registers. It is worth noting that some people may actually find the treble from the Elites to be a little bit too polite. It's not that it's super rolled off, but at the same time it's so refined and smooth that it doesn't always have the bite that some people might be looking for. One of the test tracks I use is called Simmer. I think it's by Hayley Williams, if I've got her name right. She's the ex-lead singer from Paramore, and that track has some great soundstage detail, but it can be quite hot in the treble. In listening to that on the Elites, the detail was still there in the treble, but it was very, very well controlled and easy to listen to. I didn't wince, I didn't want to pull away at all. It was just really comfortable. So as I said, some people may find that a bit too polite. I personally love it because it's a headphone I can listen to for hours and hours on end with no fatigue, complete comfort, and lots of technicality still. A few things that I particularly like about the Elite's tonal balance are that male and female vocals both come across with an equal level of quality. Sometimes headphones can skew a little bit better towards male or female depending on the tuning, but I feel like these do both really well. Whether it's a male or a female vocalist, the vocal is rich and full, but also well textured, and that's often a challenging balance for headphones to strike. Some headphones tilt too much into that presence region, which is in the upper mids, and can come across with wonderful texture, but leave the vocal sounding just a touch too thin. Others go too far the other way to give us this wonderful, rich, creamy mid-range focus, but then they miss out on some of the texture and the air that you need to make it sound realistic and not like a recording. The Elites manage both and they do it beautifully. The other area that I find them very well balanced is in their bass. They extend all the way down, and they also have a good level of presence, so they've got a bit of punch and rumble, but at the same time, they don't overdo the bass in the way that the Empyrean sometimes can. The final thing I should talk about in terms of general sound quality characteristics is staging and imaging. The stage from the Elites isn't particularly huge. It's not this massive throwing out the head stage really wide type headphone, but the structure of the soundstage is impeccable. It places each instrument really, really beautifully within the soundstage. What's particularly impressive is the way each sound is beautifully defined with a good sense of space around it. So even though it's not maybe the biggest soundstage I've heard, it is a large soundstage. So we're talking probably less than an HD 800, but up there with some of the best I've heard. And within that soundstage, because of that available space, each note has its very own placement and it's beautifully rendered. The final thing I want to talk about in relation to the Elites in a general sense before we get into the comparisons is sort of a culmination of everything I've just said. When you listen to acoustic instruments, particularly things like guitars and pianos through the Elites, they represent those sounds probably better than anything else I've heard, including the Susvara, which we will get to soon. And the reason I say that is that what the Elites manage to do beautifully is they deliver the attack of the leading edge of the sound, so it could be the pluck of the string or the hammer of the piano hitting the string. In both cases, you do get that attack, you get that articulation and that sort of little bit of extra energy at the leading edge of the note. But then they've also got the weight and presence to deliver the harmonic richness that needs to follow. So you can hear the resonance of the guitar string, you can hear the resonance of the body of the piano, but it's never overshadowing the leading edge of the notes, and it's also never overdone. So you get a sense of detail and texture and resonance. It's a beautiful package. These for me are the best headphone I've ever heard producing things like acoustic guitars. And that carries through to electric guitars as well, but acoustics have really stood out to me with the Elites. And so it probably sounds at this point like I'm saying the Elites are the perfect headphone, the best thing on the planet. And I'm going to stop short of saying that because I don't believe that's the case. I don't believe they are the perfect headphone. I don't know that the perfect headphone exists because there are always slight trade-offs. In the case of the Elite, the one area that I think might be a tiny, tiny trade-off is that a little tiny bit more treble energy might have been helpful. There's probably times that's going to bite and be uncomfortable on certain tracks, but at the same time, they are sometimes so relaxed and so comfortable to listen to despite their technical excellence that I do wonder if just a tiny bit more treble might have been helpful. And so I raise that not to cast doubt on the Elites, so much as to put into context the fact that there are going to be different headphones that suit different people. And so to help with understanding that better, let's step now through some comparisons, with the most obvious comparison being the original Empyreans. Perhaps the thing I love the most about the Empyreans is the way they're a high-end headphone that can absolutely rock. And so with that in mind, one of the test tracks that came on quite conveniently as I was shuffling through was Bassline by Korashi. This track is a bit dirty, a bit crunchy, it's relatively well recorded, but the point of it is it should drive you along, have you tapping your foot, bobbing your head, whatever your way of reacting to the music is, it should really engage you in that performance. And there's no doubt to me, the Empyreans are the slightly more fun headphones still on a track like this. So if you're listening to AC/DC, Gary Clark Jr., something like Korashi, Rage Against the Machine, you may want the Empyreans as a more fun, thumpy, sort of down and dirty headphone that still happens to perform technically very, very well. But having said that, when I went from the Empyreans back to the Elites, I could clearly hear the greater sense of transparency and detail retrieval and resolution that I was able to get. The Empyreans are fantastic, the Elites are next level. Another interesting thing that happened was that the slightly better tonal balance with not as much overall bass lift meant that I was actually hearing more of the sub-bass rumble because there wasn't as much higher level bass to kind of drown that all out and get lost in. For tracks like this, it's probably going to be a flip of a coin as to which of these I would reach for if they were both in front of me. The Elites bring benefits in terms of being able to provide more insight into a busy, rocking, thumping sort of track, but the Empyreans are still a little bit more fun. Where I landed on these two after listening to both of them side by side and flipping back and forth was that if I could own both, I probably would. I feel like the Elites are definitely the technically superior headphone, but the Empyrean's level of fun and just doing something a bit different is absolutely fantastic. Anyone who's got the Empyreans and loves them for their sense of engagement and energy and listens to those sorts of music that I spoke about before, there might not be a huge reason to go for the Elites. The Elites are the better headphone. They're superior in terms of technicalities, detail retrieval, resolution, tonal accuracy, all those things they are better, but they are trading that off for fun. So it's going to come down to whether you value pure fun and enjoyment of the music, or whether you do want to have maybe 2 or 3% less fun and get those extra technicalities instead. If you told me I had to choose just one to purchase, it would be and is the Elites. I will be buying this pair, I will be selling that pair, but it's only because the Elites are the perfect do-everything headphone, whereas the Empyreans for me weren't so good when I wanted something more reference. If I wanted to listen to a recording or a piece of gear and really understand it, I did tend to have to turn to other headphones. Even things like editing my videos, making sure I've got the sound right, the Empyreans are just too coloured for that. So for me, the Elites are the perfect choice because they bring almost the fun of the Empyreans whilst bringing everything else into balance. As I said though, if I could keep both, I absolutely would, and at one stage my plan was to keep both of these and sell the Susvara. But I'll explain shortly why I'm not doing that. Before we get there though, let's talk about the Utopia. The Focal Utopia makes for a really interesting comparison here, I think. Both of these are priced identically. They both come beautifully packaged, they're spectacularly made, they're both beautiful in their own way, they're both comfortable, although I think the Elites are slightly more comfortable. But they're also quite differently tuned, and one is a dynamic driver in the Utopia versus the isodynamic, which is essentially a variation of planar dynamic in the Elite. And it took me a couple of tracks making thorough notes to really separate these two in terms of which one I thought was doing things better and worse, and for what reasons. The first track is Stick With Me Baby by Robert Plant and Alison Krauss. Starting with the Elites, they're once again wonderfully tonally balanced. Everything just sounds perfect and effortless. The guitar in the track is clean and beautifully placed off to the side, and there's a cymbal that's just sort of shimmering away, hovering up the back of the mix. Everything was just really nicely placed. To go along with that tonal quality, both vocals, as I've already covered off, were also really well rendered. Flipping over then to the Utopias, it was really evident how differently they're tuned. All of a sudden the bass was thumping a bit harder, and that's because the Utopias are tuned with a bit of a mid-bass hump, and they actually roll off quite sharply in the sub-bass. So it's a very different presentation. You've got extension and presence from the Elites, versus a punch, but a lack of kind of foundation from the Utopias. On this particular track, I think the Utopias probably suited it a little bit better, but both were completely enjoyable in terms of bass. The things that really stood out to me though was that the vocals came across with greater sense of texture and clarity from the brighter tuning of the Utopia. Now what is the right sound is impossible to know, but the Utopia made the vocals a little bit more compelling and engaging by bringing that extra sense of detail and emphasis. Having said that, they also made the guitar that I mentioned before start to sound a little bit unnatural because things were tilted a bit too much into brightness and it lost some of the weight and the depth that the guitar should have had sitting behind those leading edges of the strums or the picking or whatever was being done to play it. And so I got to the end of that comparison thinking maybe the Utopia was ever so slightly better than the Elites. I did definitely enjoy the vocal presentation better from the Utopias on that track, but it left me wondering if it was one of those track-specific moments of magic, particularly having listened to both of these for a bit of time leading up to this review, and so I tried another track for some thorough note-taking, and this time it was Vanishing Point by Boz Scaggs. Starting out with the Utopias this time, the sound is crisp and it's clean, and the bass has a really nice thump to it. When the vocals came in, things started to get a bit harsh though. And the same for the upper end of the percussion too. It's like the Utopia is tuned to sound just a bit too detailed. It's like they're trying to make it more detailed by boosting some of those high frequencies. And when it works like in the previous track, it's great. but when it goes wrong, it does make the headphone just a bit harsh and a bit bitey. And that's a large part of why I generally only use the Utopias from my bottlehead mainline amp, is to help just smooth it over just a little tiny bit. Of course, for this comparison, I was using the same amps for both because I think it's really important to get a level playing field when we're doing a comparison like this. Now, still on Vanishing Point by Boz Scaggs, having heard the slightly overly hot, trying too hard to be detailed Utopia, I flipped over to the Elites to see if they were going to then be a bit overly smooth and leave a gap in the middle where perfection would have sat. But what I actually found was that the Elite brought everything perfectly into balance. It was a bit like a cold drink on a hot day. It was just that moment of coming from the slightly hot and harsh Utopia into something that just felt right. It was like I could relax into the music, enjoy all the details, but not feel like I was being bombarded by it. All of a sudden, with the Elites, I was also able to hear details through the mid-range that I couldn't hear from the Utopia because it was too busy emphasising the treble. Now keep in mind, I really like the Utopia. There's a reason I've kept them in my collection. But when you hear these two side by side, it's very clear that the Elite, to me at least, has the right tonal balance, whereas the Focal's playing tricks. They're not necessarily bad tricks because when they hit a sweet spot, they're fantastic, but the Utopias don't have kind of the do-it-all technical capability that the Elites possess. One of the details that really stood out to me as I listened to the Elites is there's a very short guitar solo, about probably 2/3 of the way through the track, and in behind the guitar solo, there's a lower frequency keyboard melody. With the Elites, that keyboard melody was much more present and available. When I went back to the Utopias, I discovered the reason I didn't hear it was there's this constant ringing percussive note that's being overdone by the Utopias and completely obliterating your ability to hear into the mids the same way. Again, it's not to say the Utopias are a horrible listen, but it goes to show the value of a well-balanced tonality, letting you hear everything that's going on in the music. The final thing I want to mention is that on this track, Vanishing Point, the Elites have less thump than the Utopias, as I've already covered off, but what they do have instead is a presence and fullness. And it actually works better on this track than having the mid-bass hump of the Utopias, because the Utopias have the punch, but there's nothing behind it. There's no substance, there's no foundation to support that punch. In the case of the Elites, they may not have that initial emphasis in that kind of percussive piece of the bass, but they've got a foundation that means that after it hits, albeit not as hard, it feels like it belongs, it's got weight, and it's not lost in the mix. So at this point, I did one more quick test to really help me separate and hopefully clarify the Utopia versus the Elite question, and that was to listen to some classical tracks. I'm not going to list them here because I flipped through a few just to get a nice variety of flavours. And what I found was that the Utopias may give you a slightly better sense of bite in the strings and a little bit of extra brightness and textural quality from the orchestra, but they can also get a bit bright and a bit harsh at times. I found the Elites, because of their more balanced tonality, also provided me with a better sense of scale across the orchestra. And again, that's to do with the fact that you can hear all of the mid-range details, you can hear the bass notes when they're being maintained and held. Everything just kind of sits better in the overall sonic landscape when we're talking about the Elites. The Focals can't quite manage that because they've got that mid-bass hump, they've got a bit of a treble peak, and there's a little bit of a hole in the mid-range compared to how well the Elites are balanced. Again, I'm not bashing the Utopias, they're a wonderful, wonderful headphone, but it's worth noting the differences, and I do think the Elites are the superior headphone if you want something that's going to do everything well. If you want a headphone that specifically does certain things well or pairs up with just the right amplifier to produce a really magical sound, there's definitely still a place for the Utopias. So please don't get me wrong and think I'm bashing them. They are wonderful and I own them for a reason. And so I guess to sum that up, what I'd say is that given the right circumstances, the right music, the right amplifier, I do think the Utopias can hit a sweet spot that's maybe even better than the Elites can do, but the Elites are going to hit the sweet spot far more often. And the difference between the sweet spot of the Elite and the sweet spot of the Utopia is a 1 or 2% type thing. And as I said, it's going to be very specific on the Utopias, whereas it's much more general on the Elites. I haven't put anything through the Elites that I haven't enjoyed. Some things have been spectacular, but everything's been great. And I can't always say the same for the Utopias. And so after that marathon comparison, let's finish up with one more in the form of the HiFiMan Susvara. It's not been that long since I reviewed the Susvaras, and if you've watched that review, you'll know that I absolutely love their technical capabilities. But you'll also know that they're a headphone that I don't necessarily reach for pure enjoyment. If you're not familiar with them, the Susvaras are a $6,000 planar magnetic headphone from HiFiMan. So that makes them a full $2,000 more than the Elites here. Before I get into the sound quality comparison, I do want to mention that there is no doubt in my mind that the Elites are the better made headphone. Everything on them, from the materials used, the form factor, the comfort, and the Susvaras are very comfortable, but the Elites are just another level again. Everything about the Elites is better than what you get on the Susvara from a design, materials, comfort point of view. Some areas it's a significant improvement, such as the machining and the quality of the finish. Other areas it's a subtle difference where the Elites are maybe 5% more comfortable than the Susvara. It's not a big deal. I could wear either headphone all day, no problems at all. So I think value for money in terms of build quality and finish and look, I think the Elite are definitely a much better proposition. But by the time we're spending $4,000 and $6,000 it's not going to be just about which one looks and feels the best. They have to perform. Interestingly, when I did my comparisons for these when I was sitting down taking notes, the next track that came on straight after the Utopia comparison was Bright Light's Bigger City by CeeLo. And I thought, why not? We'll leave that on and we'll see how these two kind of flagship premium headphones tackle something that's very much not audiophile. Starting with the Elites on this one, they were immediately fun and punchy and full of energy on that track. You can clearly hear the distorted bass coming through from the mix, so that's in the recording, it's not in the headphones themselves. And the presentation was expansive and spacious, but overall quite noisy. And what I mean by that is this recording has lots of stuff going on, so you're not going to get any pristine placement of sounds in this particular song because there's just too much happening. What the Elites managed to do with that though was just put everything where it belonged in terms of nothing was overemphasized, nothing was pushed too far forwards, everything was just really well balanced, and it just allowed me to enjoy the music and groove along to it. Flipping over to the Susvara was pretty eye-opening. It managed to sound even cleaner and more resolving than the Elites. It actually cut through some of that kind of noisiness in the track and let me hear finer details that I didn't necessarily get from the Elites. Having said that, it did lack some of the bass weight that a track like this needs. So with that went a bit of fun and engagement, and instead I was getting some technicalities. On a track like this, the Susvara can get a little bit dry and a little bit harsh. It's not really nasty, but it's not quite as enjoyable as something like the Elite. So it's a bit of a trade-off. What you're getting by having that extra emphasis in the upper mids and treble from the Susvara compared to the Elite is you're going to get more detail and clarity coming through, but you're going to be trading it off with a lack of enjoyment and engagement depending on the track. And so I moved on from Bright Light's Bigger City, having seen that both of these headphones can excel with absolutely anything. They retain their own character, but they're absolutely impressive no matter what you throw at them. And so what I threw at them next was Human by Rag & Bone Man. This is one of my favourite albums of all time. I absolutely love it. It's not the best recording, but it's good enough. And with both of these headphones, I heard things in that recording I've never noticed before. And I know that sounds cliche, but when it starts off, there's this regular percussive sound on the second and fourth beats of every bar. And all of a sudden I could hear all of these layers of detail within that sound. It sounds like someone's wearing a whole lot of chains on their arm and like clapping their hands or doing something, so you get this kind of regular thump of all these chains making each of their individual sounds. And both of these headphones manage to extract every single one of those little sounds from every one of those hits. Once again on this track, the Susvara separates individual sounds incredibly well. That's really where I think the Susvara is unparalleled in this hobby. Its ability to provide insight and clarity through any mix, no matter how busy it is really phenomenal. With the Susvara's incredible bass extension, it reaches way down into the track. You can hear all the bass all the way to the bottom, but it doesn't have quite enough for a track like this. This is a track that's driven along by a hard, thumping, slow bass line, and the Susvara never quite captured me with that rhythm. What it did capture me with, though, was the vocal. It was so clear, so textured, and so well defined that it's absolutely compelling. And that's really what the Susvara to me is all about. It's providing that absolute insight, like you're standing there, right there with the musicians, and therefore able to hear everything. Tonally, it's not always exactly like you're standing there with the musicians, but in terms of detail and transparency, there is nothing missing from anything. Coming from the Susvara to the Elites, I was expecting a fair step down in terms of detail. And what I heard, which surprised me, was that the Elites came very, very close to the Susvara. What was interesting though was that it was similar levels of detail, not quite the same, but very, very close, but delivered differently. So again, there's that slightly extra sense of warmth in the lower mids. They're not thick or muddy or anything like that, but they've just got less of that upper mid emphasis and a more balanced sort of upper mid and regular mid-range emphasis, if you like. And so the details were there, but they weren't quite as enhanced and magnified, if you like, as they are from the Susvara. Interestingly, for those that want a bit more detail and maybe like what I'm saying about the Elites versus the Susvara, but do want to hear a bit more of that detail, a bit more of that upper sort of mid-range energy and information, the Alcantara pads on the Elites take the Elites another step closer to the Susvara sound without going quite all the way there. And that's where I love the Elites for having those two flavours that are both excellent. But back to the comparison, where the Elites did go ahead of the Susvara for me was their ability to provide bass which was tactile and solid. The Susvaras come across just a little tiny bit lean, like a few dB of bass lift would be magic on the Susvara, but again it's going to throw off what they do so well with that upper mid-range clarity. I also found the vocal, because of the extra presence and weight that it has from down low, the vocal came across a bit smoother and it probably sounded a bit more natural. It had a bit more of the natural resonance that a big voice like his is going to have. But again, it was a trade-off for a little bit of texture being lost. Maybe not lost, but being ramped down a little bit in the mix, more in balance with the rest of his vocal qualities. And overall, I'd say that the Elite came across a little bit more polite, for better or worse. So it's not a headphone that gets kind of raucous and out of control at all. It always keeps things very smooth, very controlled and refined, and yet still manages to provide lots of thump and engagement from bass. It provides a good sense of detail, but it doesn't give you quite the edge and attack that something like a Susvara can give, or even a Utopia like I said before. Now for me, I do think the Elite is pretty close to perfect, and so what I'm saying there is not a knock on it. It's not to say you shouldn't get it. It's just to point out the fact that the Susvara is imperfect in the sense that it lacks some of that engagement and fun sometimes. The Elite is imperfect in the sense that it lacks that last little bit of attack and detail and clarity. And that's what I said at the beginning of this review, where I said, I don't know if there is such a thing as the perfect headphone. If you added more treble to the Elite, either by reducing the bass or bumping the treble, it's going to shift the overall tonal qualities of it, and it's probably going to become less fun. Likewise, as I said before, if you added more bass to the Susvara, you'd start to mask some of the detail and clarity that makes it so exceptional. So there is no such thing as the perfect headphone. For me personally though, the Elite is getting very close, and probably more so than the Susvara. Technically, the Susvara is the perfect headphone, I think, or the best I've heard anyway. But for an overall listening experience, I do think the Elite brings it together into a really excellent overall package. But before I wrap up entirely, I do want to mention I did some classical listening with these two as well. And for those of you looking for a classical masterpiece of a headphone, the Susvara is clearly better for that style of music. It separates the sounds better. It's like you can hear every single instrument in the orchestra. Whereas from the Elites, things do tend to become a little bit less like you can hear all, 80 odd instruments in the orchestra. It's more like you're hearing each section of the orchestra. It's still wonderful, fantastic. It's a slightly smoother listen than the Susvara, which can still get a bit dry at times with the strings and other high frequency sounds. But if you want to feel like you're sitting in the front couple of rows of a concert hall, hearing an orchestra, and you can hear every single instrument, the Susvara still wins. If you want to sit back and relax, like you're sitting in maybe the 10th or 15th row of the concert hall, listening to an orchestra and just taking in the emotional experience, then the Elite's definitely the choice. So both have their benefits, both have their strengths. It's just depending on what you're looking for. And so at this point, as you've no doubt already gathered, I think the Elite is an absolutely phenomenal headphone. I think in some ways it's left me a tiny bit disappointed because it comes so close to perfection and doesn't quite manage to do it. But as I said, I don't know that it's even possible. The Susvara doesn't do it, the Utopia doesn't do it, I'm yet to hear some other flagships, maybe they do it, but I doubt that anything can actually balance everything at once because there are too many variables at play. So as it stands, the Elite is a headphone that I will highly recommend to anybody as the perfect headphone to listen to all genres, with a focus on enjoyment and engagement in the music, but without some of the trade-offs that the Empyrean did have. Now you've got a much more tonally balanced headphone that sounds just right across everything. It's a headphone you can wear for hours and hours on end comfortably, both in terms of the physical comfort, but also the sonic comfort. It's not going to shred your eardrums. It's not going to attack you if the recording is less than perfect. Whether I was listening to old Motown recordings or early 90s or late 80s hip-hop recordings with really bad samples, the Elites consistently sounded good. They let me know it was a bad recording, but they never punished me for it. Whereas I do find with the Susvara, they can punish sometimes, and the Utopia as well. And so that's where the Elites really sit for me. I've chosen to purchase these for myself. As I said before, I am having to sell the Empyreans to do that, but it's a decision that I'm gladly going to make because since these have been here, these are the headphone I've reached for every single day to do my editing, to do my general video watching, to do my music listening, to test other gear. They are just able to do everything so well that even though they might only reach maybe 95% of perfection, they do it across everything. And that to me is really special. So if you're in the market for a super high-end headphone and you're only ever going to own one perhaps, the Elite should absolutely be right up the top of your list. If you're fortunate enough to be able to have multiple flagship headphones, then they are one that I think is worth considering in the collection. But there is still an argument for something like an Empyrean and a Susvara, or maybe a Utopia and an Empyrean, whatever combination you think makes sense to you. These are a headphone that are fantastic in the sense that they kind of take the Empyrean and the Susvara and they meet somewhere in the middle. What that means is they might not be different enough from the Susvara for some people, or different enough from the Empyreans for some people, but for me, I'm very comfortable having these as my everyday go-to, the Susvaras as my, I really want absolute maximum insight into some music or a piece of gear, and then the Utopias I've kept as a flagship dynamic, but they might be on their way out the door soon if I can get my hands on something like a Verite Open. So we'll see, watch this space for that one, stay subscribed if you want to continue hearing more about flagship headphones, or indeed any other headphones or earphones. I've got lots of great gear coming up. Please do think about subscribing and ringing the bell so you don't miss out. For now though, I'll leave it to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.